our next speaker is Mr. Alexander Ogevin Ritter. He is a part of ISA. Alex is a private sector specialist, specifically on the solar side, and he engages a lot with manufacturers, developer, and financiers, and he covers both sides of public and private sectors to exchange idea and to work solutions together. And he holds an MBA degree from Indian School of Business and a degree in engineering from University of Waterloo. So I'll welcome you, Alex.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Dr. Ajif, and thank you so much for inviting me as well. I think it's been fantastic to be here and hear all these excellent talks. I might actually cut my talk short because I think a lot of this work on energy system modeling has already been covered by some of the previous speakers. But yeah, I think what I really want to focus on is more of the near term. And I worry sometimes when we talk about the 2050 and the 2070, we kind of miss opportunities that are today. And I think I was talking to Dr. Deepika at lunch actually about even though this massive savings from the solar program, how much trouble it is and how challenging it is just to get internal approval to install this solar system. And so I think that's very telling of a lot of the kind of challenges that are faced. Okay, that's very representative of the kind of challenges that India is facing as a whole. So I think we all know new wind and solar are substantially cheaper than coal. That's hopefully not without question, despite what some people may think. But here's, I think, something that might be a little bit more surprising. Demand is growing, and I think we absolutely should be trying to minimize demand growth. But at the same time, for India to grow at a GDP of 8 to 9% a year, electricity demand is going to have to grow at least 4 to 5% a year. So 1,600 terawatt hours times 5%, that's 80 terawatt hours a year. And so for 80 terawatt hours a year, that's about 35 to 40 gigawatts of renewables. And so I'm not talking about retiring coal and the just transition. I'm not talking about green hydrogen or electric vehicles. I'm talking about just meeting the needs of India's economic growth. So, the economics are there, but the deployment has not yet happened. Instead, we're still building coal plants. So these are the 8 coal plants that were built last year. None of them were economic. Minemouth coal, Darlapali, is close to economic, but I think when people often talk about the trade-off between development and environment, I think it's very important to realize that there is no trade-off specifically for the power sector. Specifically for the power sector, wind and solar plus storage is cheaper than coal today and has been for several years now. And I think another thing that often confuses people is, they think of coal, they think of 24/7 power. But you have to remember that load is not flat. We don't actually need 24/7 power. We need that evening peak. And so I used to work for a distribution utility back in Canada. Our evening peak was a little different than India's evening peak. But the point is, at 4 a.m., there's actually lots and lots of surplus power. So when people say, oh, well, we need 24-hour storage, yes, one day in 2050 or 2060 when we want to be fully net zero. But for now, we need to meet this evening peak. And as you all know, we still have power outages in India, right? And I kind of give the remark, if coal is so reliable, why do we have power outages? And the reason we have power outages with coal is because if you overbuild coal to meet that evening peak, it becomes very, very expensive, because running coal at a low CUF is extremely expensive. Whereas if you build the coal just to meet your base load, then you don't meet your evening peak, right? So I think a lot of people have this assumption that coal is reliable without necessarily thinking through how it works from a power systems perspective. So RE plus storage, I won't go into too much detail, but here's my assumptions. I assume this presentation will be shared. And it's very important to right-size the storage. And this is what I alluded to this morning, where if you have a standalone system, so we're talking, let's say, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where we want to get rid of the diesel, there we need a 99% reliable system. But if we're talking about the Indian grid, if I've got some solar in Karnataka and some solar in Kanpur and some solar in Rajasthan and some solar in Delhi, it might be cloudy today at IIT Kanpur, but somewhere in the country it's going to be sunny. So again, this myth that you need RE plus storage to have 99% coverage is just not necessary. So what I propose is about a 92% coverage, which is still more reliable than the typical coal plant in India, which has a 74% availability factor. And this gets us to about rupees 3.5 per kilowatt hour. So I think there's this obsession sometimes with, solar should be 2 rupees per kilowatt hour, or no, we can't do it because it's not reliable. We need to start thinking of the middle ground. How do we combine solar, a little bit of wind, a little bit of storage, to be both reliable enough and also economic, as opposed to going through just solar, which is super cheap, and literally 100% reliability. So this is what it looks like if you were to install this sort of hybrid system. You have your solar during the day, you take your surplus solar during the day, and meet your evening peak with storage. That's the green in the evening, and this is the median day, so it's a 95%. So that little bit of gray at the end is your 5% that's not covered. And luckily for India, wind and solar are actually a fairly nice complement. Wind tends to blow in monsoon and at night times, whereas monsoon is the weakest months for solar, and obviously you don't get solar during the day. Your worst day, as of now, is you still wouldn't meet it. But this is my point. For a few hundred hours a year, it doesn't make sense to build coal. Because if you build a coal plant for 500 hours a year, that fixed cost of that coal plant is extremely expensive. And then the question is, and this will be more relevant in 2030, 2040, 2050, is what do you do with the surplus solar on the surplus days? So for now, I would suggest you can sell it in the market. There are still power cuts during the day, particularly in rural areas. So it's best to have cheap power for rural areas. But in the future, we're going to have to think about green hydrogen, load shifting. I was hoping to see this thermal storage system today, but I didn't get around to it. But having air conditioning pre-cooled during the day, you freeze your ice, and then you use that cooling in the evening. And this is, I think, the key point I want people to take away. And I've suggested to Dr. Rajiv, if there's master's or PhD students thinking of a thesis in the audience, I'd love to see a carbon abatement curve for India. So carbon abatement curve basically lines up all your carbon abatement options from negative cost ones, like building more efficient buildings or having energy efficient lighting, all the way to the very, very expensive ones like carbon capture. And so I would encourage people to think about things that are negative cost, so things like building efficiency, things like electrification of vehicles. I was very pleased to see the electric three-wheelers here on campus. Hopefully that can be extended to four-wheelers of our professors as well. Meeting this power, building the 10 megawatts of solar. To me, we should be prioritizing trying to deploy these today. For 2030, then we need to talk about, IT Kanpur needs 40 megawatts of solar plus 120 megawatt hours of storage. That's 400 crores worth of investment for RE plus storage. And that's a big number. That's a scary number. So I think sometimes we get scared by the cost of meeting net zero, that we don't end up doing the steps today. So the key takeaway here is let's start making progress today. Let's start deploying the economic options today. Buildings especially, if you're building a building today, it's still going to be around in 2072, which is post the net zero target of 2070. So let's make sure we're making good decisions, whether it's insulation, whether it's natural cooling, whether it's partial shading, whether it's energy efficient HVAC equipment. We need to be making those decisions today, even for net zero 2070 target. Not that we shouldn't be doing trials and experiments on carbon capture and green hydrogen and these other things, but the deployment should be less of a priority. So India in 2050, I know the net zero target is 2070, but I think the power system really should be targeting 2050, just on a purely economic basis alone. Luckily, India has a very diverse solar resource, so the sun is shining somewhere in India, whether it's Karnataka, Rajasthan, Gujarat, India, Delhi, Kanpur, somewhere the sun is shining today. Unlike, say, Germany, where you can literally have all of Germany be cloudy on a given day. So you could just overbuild your solar 2 times. So you could just build 1,000 gigawatts of solar and enough storage and say that's all we need. There is probably a more economic option. This is just one sample by 2050, primarily solar-based, with some wind, some nuclear, some biomass, and some demand response, which I think one of the speakers earlier today talked about demand response, which is completely unused right now in India. Again, I'm happy to follow up on the details, but I recognize we're running short of time. But the point I'm trying to make here is that a 100% electric grid by 2050 is both possible and maybe economic. So I want to play with this Safari tool that C-Step mentioned. So yeah, I think for things that are already economic, like electric vehicles and grid scale, I think we should really be focusing on deployment. I think there's certain other things where we need to be doing more research to bring the cost down. Green hydrogen. We need to be doing research on, let's say, material science to bring down the cost of electrolyzers. And then I think, by 2070, there's some stuff that's very, very difficult. Like, I don't hear anybody talking about cattle-based methane emissions. This is like 10% of global greenhouse emissions, and I don't see Indians stopping drinking milk anytime soon. So what are we going to do about the methane emissions from cattle? Are we going to have artificial milk? Are we going to have some sort of food additive that reduces the methane? I don't know. But I'm trying to differentiate here. The stuff on the left, we should be prioritizing deployment. And the stuff on the right, we should be prioritizing basic research into coming up with new innovative solutions. So I know I talked very quickly, so hopefully that was comprehensible. But I did want to leave plenty of time for the panel. And I actually have to leave at 4 myself for another call. So thank you all for your time. Hopefully this was helpful and illuminating.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I'll open it for a couple of questions. We have a question? Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. No, I was just making a quick remark. It's not a question on the agricultural emissions that you talked about. There are ongoing research which looks at ration balancing with the livestock, the feedstock that you provide, because that's the most immediate way in which you can look at reducing methane emissions. So that's going on. In fact, in UP there's a pilot going on right now. So they're early days, but I think that's work is happening.
So, just before my question, so in case you have to rush, Alex, actually the session is going to start and it will take at least 90 minutes. So maybe we can take a few more questions for you now so that we can excuse you early on to the panel, if you want to do early. My question is that since you talk about the cost, and I've been asking this question, I don't know, from yesterday, today, I was really fascinated by sort of your numbers, and if you have time, you can elaborate a little more on, that why other speakers are sort of contemplating the fact that this RE, especially solar plus batteries, are not really cost competitive when they talk about the whole system's cost. Vis-a-vis what you are sharing in your slide it is actually, even today, quite cost competitive, even with storage. See, yesterday a colleague said from MP government that only the storage cost itself comes to around 5 rupees a unit. Even if you talk about the pump storage facility, and if you talk about batteries, it will be like minimum of 6 or 7. So I don't know how you compare those numbers. And secondly, any comment on like these embodied emissions? We keep hearing about this term, that you need to put a lot of investments into generating these modules and so on and so forth. Yeah?
Right. So partly this is a mindset shift. So we know solar and wind are variable, right? And so we know the coal has to ramp up and down. And so if your mindset is coal is the primary source of energy and solar and wind are the nuisance, then that cost of ramping up and down, you say, well, that's the wind and solar's cost. Where I would argue you need to get over that hump and say, if you have a renewables-led system, which countries like Germany or Greece or South Australia have, then you say, no. Solar and wind are the primary source, And the cost of ramping up and down, that's the coal's cost. Coal is the one that's having to ramp up and down. And so that's where storage comes in. You know, I'm lucky I come from a place in Canada where we have a lot of hydropower. And so my assumption is that hydropower is very fast at ramping up and down, and hydro is providing that service. And coal is max 1% per minute ramp rate. So the fact that coal is unable to ramp, the fact that coal can't turn on and off, to me that cost I would ascribe to the inflexibility of coal. I would not ascribe that to the cost of wind and solar. And storage has a much, much faster ramp rate. Storage is like milliseconds ramp rate. And so I think that's the missing picture, where people aren't thinking about storage as providing that ramping service. They're thinking about coal still being the primary source of energy.
So just sort of an addition to that. So
Yeah.
maybe that's one of the cases, but also here in India, which is possibly different from Canada, is like the legal contracts are designed in such a way of these long-term power purchase agreement from the thermal power plant that the fixed cost needs to be paid irrespective whether you're using ramping up, ramping down, doesn't matter.
Exactly.
So maybe those are the costs when you define the system cost is what I'm assuming.
So that's why I get so frustrated by the fact that we're still building coal plants, right? Because, as I said, we need to build 35, 40 gigawatts of solar and wind just to meet demand growth. So I'm saying let's not touch the existing coal plants. Let's not touch the existing PPAs. Those existing coal plants are going to be needed until their end of life. I'm talking about the new plants. And I think that's another distinction. People are mixing up new versus existing. And this is what I'm comparing against. I'm comparing against the new PPAs. I'm not saying break our old PPAs. I'm saying don't sign new PPAs. And then the third piece on that is right-sizing the storage. So again, if you 5 rupees per kilowatt hour actually sounds pretty low if you ask me for energy storage, but it's the blended cost that matters. And again, if you were to build a coal plant just to meet 3 hours, its fixed cost would be 16, 18 rupees per kilowatt hour. But if you build a storage just to meet the 3-hour peak, I mean, Delhi it's 3 hours. Delhi it's 6 to 9 p.m. I don't know Uttar Pradesh how long their peak is, but that's the point. We're not building storage for 24 hours. We're building storage to meet that peak. Eventually, in 2040, 2050, we need to build enough storage to meet, well, not 24 hours, 16 hours. But by that point, storage should have fallen in costs. Right now, we should be focusing on just meeting that evening peak with storage. And then your second question was on the embedded cost of carbon? Embodied emissions. Yeah, so I don't want to trivialize that. I've read a number of papers on that. Some people say 2 to 3 years. I've seen 4 years. But the bottom line is, yes, it's non-zero, but no, it's not going to substantially change your calculation.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions?
Thanks, very good presentation. I think around this slide only. So I have a few points I want to make that why we are missing something which is positive or battery. And then there is something where probably the analysis needs to talk on also. One of the other positives of battery, you have uncertainty and variability. Right now, you are only capturing the value of variability. If you actually talk about uncertainty also, then the value of battery is higher. It's the plus side. Okay, so as a condition, I identify this as a result. Second thing is, you are charging at when the demand is also going to ramp up, 8, 9, 10 a.m. So perhaps you may want to look into your model and say something that, I think that's the charging one, is it?
Yeah, no, so this date, again, this is November 20th.
8 a.m. to 10 a.m.
Yeah, so I've taken data from an actual real wind farm and real solar plants, and this wind farm happened to have lots of wind blowing from 8 to 10.
No, I understand that. What I'm saying is, from a modeling perspective, from a power systems perspective, we don't want to put this into storage. We want to put something which is there in the middle of the day, not this one. This power should not be good, because at that time you need a lot of ramping, because the dam is ramping at that time.
Oh, yes, okay, sorry. Yes, right, I'm putting all the storage into 3 hours rather than spreading it out. Yes. In real life, you would level it out to manage your ramp better. It's the quantity that matters, not the...
You talked about abatement cost there, right? I have told this to my PhD student.
Good.
This is something we need.
Yeah.
There was one, in fact, I don't know how much in depth they did. This was a McKinsey curve.
Yes, the McKinsey.
You might have seen it, but I always doubt about how much in depth they have gone into that.
I've got a longer version of this presentation, which includes that McKinsey cost curve, but I have not seen that for India. So I would love to see that.
Yeah, it was for India.
For India?
I think I saw it. Someone
Okay.
shared it with me.
I've seen it for global.
I think it came from one of my students. If I recall, there was something for India.
All right, please do send it. Next year when I deliver this presentation, I will include the IIT Kanpur carbon cost abatement curve for India. I'd love to see that. And the point that actually you made about the forecast error. And so in India, you don't have an ancillary services market. So it's very difficult to monetize that. Well, I came here in 2016 and I gave a presentation on the ancillary services market coming up in 2016. Yeah.
Additional cost, the ramping, which has to be done by or ramp up by the port.
Yeah.
I don't think that's correct. It is because of the renewable. It should be activated. As a system operator, as a planner, I will always activate it. They are not the pools. Had it not been there, I would have never incurred that cost.
But that's what I'm saying. If you look at the 2050 system, if you you need to get over that mindset. Right now we're 70% coal.
No, it's not mindset. It is essentially who's imposing that cost.
But that's you're imposing it. You're assuming you have an existing coal system, and you're imposing solar and wind on it. I'm saying by 2050, you could have an entirely solar wind storage system, and the fact that you have a little bit of coal, which you can't turn off, it would let's reverse the world. Let's say we had global cooling. And we used to have solar and wind because it was super cheap. And now people are saying, we got to start building coal because the earth is getting too cold. Let's go build coal. And people would say, but look, coal is providing all this baseload power. It's so expensive to turn on and off to match the nice, beautiful wind solar storage system we have.
As of now, that's not the situation. The whole system is based on it's not there.
So that's my point. By 2050, if you think about 2050 and work backwards, you need to start thinking about having a renewables-led system, or more precisely, a storage-led system, and move backwards. But I appreciate that point.
Okay, I think it's a very enjoyable conversation happening between Anup and Alex, and I can see a generation gap happening here. So I can see the old coal versus the new solar fighting it out. So I don't know, I'm kind of your generation, Anup, but I think somewhere down the line, one assumption that we're making is that the demand will continue to be the same. We're assuming the future will be the same as the past, and I don't think that will be the case. For example, transportation sector. So I work with electric vehicles, and I'm sure we will have grids which are smart enough to decide when vehicles should get charged. Right?
Yep.
So now it will happen more and more in future, and I think it's so all our discussions have been about supply, but we are doing that in isolation, right? We will be talking a lot about system level things. A system level should look both at how to manage supply and how to manage demand also.
Yeah.
Right? I think that will happen, and some of the problems about variability, etc., that you were talking about, Anup, will probably be taken care of that. That's my hypothesis. That's just thought.
There are many more problems which I will tell you.
But we don't, that's a great point though. We don't have time of day pricing. Maharashtra has a little bit of a 1 rupee extra and 1 rupee less. But proper time of day pricing. So my friend in Australia, her solar only gets 5 cents a kilowatt hour during the day, but she pays 25 cents a kilowatt hour in the evening. And so that's the actual cost. And so she has to decide whether to build a storage. Demand response. When I used to work for utility, for let's say 40 hours a year, when we were really, really tight, we called up a big fertilizer producer and said, hey, can you turn off your lines? And it was very, very expensive. We paid them a huge discount on their power bill to give us those power for 40 hours. But that's way cheaper than building a coal plant that's only going to run 40 hours a year. We don't have any demand response yet. We don't have any time of day pricing. So we need to start these conversations now.
We have time of day across all these things.
But the differential's tiny. So I'll give an example with the coal. So in British Columbia, where I used to work, we actually were a net energy importer on a volume basis, but we were a net energy exporter on a value basis because they had really inflexible coal. And because they had a proper market design, the coal was punished for that. The coal had to take the $0 per megawatt hour, not because there was lots of renewables, but because it was the middle of the night. And India traditionally has been not been power surplus, so this hasn't been an issue. But if India wants to meet the reliability that the people of India deserve, you need to have surplus build, which means your coal plant at 4 a.m. is redundant. And so your coal plant is providing zero value. Not even talking about renewables, just the coal plant. And so we actually made an arbitrage where we would buy the coal at zero and then sell it back to them at peak for $100 a megawatt hour. That's not talk. This was 15 years ago. This was before wind and solar. If you have a surplus system, if you have a power surplus system, the inflexibility of coal is a cost. But India's just getting to the point where it's getting to a power surplus system. So that cost, the cost is hidden. The cost is rural farmers getting their power cut, getting load shed during peaks. That's the cost that right now is currently getting ignored. That's the cost, that's the reliability of cost of coal that the current system models are not currently accounting for.
I guess we are at IIT Kanpur, and as a technical institution, we should be asking this question. And I've not seen this being discussed by many people who put up these arguments. Is what about load flow and stability of the grid? I mean, we are not burning coal for this fun, right?
Yep.
At the end of the day, we're trying to provide stable power at 49.5 to 50.5 hertz, at least
Yep.
in India. I mean, how does this play out in that circumstance? I mean,
Yeah.
you are assuming that a place in Kanpur is going to produce power for a place in Gujarat, and it's going to show up there, magically.
So a few things. One is, who here has been in a home with a stabilizer? Who here seen a stabilizer on an air conditioning well, usually it's not an air conditioning, right?
I live in Bombay, so I never had.
But when I first came to India, I said, what's that funny thing on your air conditioner, right? And again, people say coal is reliable. And I say, well, no, it's not. Because you have a coal-based system, and the rich people, the privileged people sitting in this room have stabilizers. But the demand-supply mismatch and the slow ramp rate of coal, right?
So I mean, that's fine. It's a
Okay.
bad question to
No,
ask
no,
you
no,
because you can't answer it. It's difficult.
Let me-
It is an analysis that has to be done separately. The other part I will just say is that the analogy you put about coal actually having to meet the needs of renewables is disingenuous, because it's like me saying that I'll come into your house, I will turn your lights on off at a particular rate, you blink your eyes at the rate it needs to be. That's what it is.
Okay, a couple things. One is storage. Storage provides that stability much faster. And there's a role for storage to be co-located with solar and wind to reduce transmission costs separately. And you see like utilities in Delhi putting the storage on the distribution frame. So that provides reliability much better than coal can. Secondly, I was surprised when I first came to India. One of my very first presentations was on synchronous condensers. There's almost no synchronous condensers used in India. So, no, I just want to, I'm almost done. So you take Dadri, which is providing power at 6.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. Absolutely, convert those to synchronous condensers to continue to provide inertia and stability to the Delhi region. Take Trombay, which is providing power at 8 rupees per kilowatt hour. Absolutely, convert that to a synchronous condenser. So we talk about just transition. There's some coal jobs right there. Take those people and continue to run the plant as a synchronous condenser. So the long answer is you need to do the full system study. But the short answer is energy storage and synchronous condensers.
So we'll come back to your question. The following panel will have a lot of these questions. Answer to his question. Okay, we have just last 30 seconds because we need to really give a big hand of applause to my friend Alex for us. But let's do that. And with so many questions. And thank you for that, Alex. Yeah.
I think when I entered, this was a very pertinent question to my heart. That is what we are studying and doing also. You are right that when you add more solar, because of the rotating machines are less in the system, inertia becomes less. That's a big challenge. Second thing is that it creates a stability issue. Second is the power flow becomes bidirectional. So protection has to be designed accordingly. But good thing is that these converters also controls can be designed to add synthetic inertia to the system, which actually improves the stability. A lot of our group also has done.
So this really segues
nicely into the last session of the day, which is more about interactions and discussing ideas in a panel format. But once again, a good round of applause for Alex from the ISA. Alex, we'll let you go because you have to leave at 4 and we're almost touching 4. But thanks a lot. You managed to address a lot of these questions which we're thinking of asking you in the panel discussion. Thank you once again.